folks. Welcome to Narrative Structures in Peter Bruegel's Art, which traces the development of storytelling devices in the art of Netherlandish painter Bruegel, active in the 1560s. Bruegel is well known for nostalgia-tinged depictions of rural life which appealed to the urban bourgeois patrons of his time. This short survey will show a steady development in storytelling technique through his short career. We'll begin with a half-dozen Italian artworks that show the development of Renaissance structures and their gradual dissolution during the 16th century. Michelangelo will illustrate this pivot point as his painting literally decenters the careful constructions of the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Bruegel, whose career overlaps the very end of Michelangelo's long career, inherited this decentered tradition and built from it a succession of narrative structures, which we'll study later in this show. Let's start with Giotto, a Central Italian painter from around 1300. He carries forward the late medieval or Gothic Madonna and Child motif. It's a centrally focused structure featuring loose symmetry and subdued emotions. Despite the rigid structure, contemporary viewers would have been aware of the narrative elements embodied in the painting. There's Jesus interacting with his earthly mother, surrounded by the angels and saints who've welcomed his birth. Giotto's fully modeled figures point forward to the Italian Renaissance, usually dated from around 1400 forward. Here's a question. What structural function does the pagoda serve, and what would this mean in narrative terms? Sandro Botticelli, High Renaissance Classicism. Botticelli, Centro-Italian, Florentine, 1470 or so, maintains a centrally focused structure despite having four distinct groups in this allegorical painting. If we ignore the kind of odd character at the far left who looks like he's in a different painting, the white and red-robed goddess stands in the middle of two roughly symmetrical triads. Notice the halo of greenery around the central figure. Educated Florentines, this painting was executed for the elite Medici family, would have glimpsed many narrative elements in this complex painting, as well as allusions to contemporary politics and probably marriage prospects. So let's consider, what is the function of that halo of greenery? In a narrative, how would you replicate these groups of figures and that halo around the central figure? Leonardo, also High Renaissance Classicism. Leonardo da Vinci, around 1470, continues to work with a centrally focused structure in this quasi-historical painting. Notice how the disciples lean away from the central figure of Jesus, so he gets a little extra space, and he's also framed by a bright window, emphasizing the solid center of this work. Notice also Jesus' triangle shape there, just doesn't get more solid than that. The disciples themselves are clustered into four groups of three, each of which has its own internal drama. Contemporaries would have recognized the striking narrative moment when Jesus declares, "One of you will betray me," as well as minor incidents such as Judas, fourth from the left, dark hair, clutching the money purse, and Peter, just to Jesus' left, one finger pointing upward, assuring Jesus of his loyalty. Structurally, Leonardo focuses on a single dramatic moment of the story, maintaining a visual and temporal unity. At the same time, the four subgroups of disciples allow the painting to be read sequentially as a series of interlocking narratives. Consider this structure, a central focus flanked by subgroups, each with their own internal drama. How could you use this structure to portray a group of characters in a novel? What would this mean in terms of plot? How would you unify these distinct subgroups or subplots? How does Leonardo achieve unity here? Raphael, High Renaissance Classicism, Central Italy around 1500. Raphael carries the central focus to an extreme, constructing a perfectly balanced Madonna in an inherently unstable round frame. This painting is classical in several senses, in the Greek sense of emotional equilibrium and poise, the structural sense of the balance and clarity, and in the historical sense that it was copied and adapted for the next 400 or 500 years. Note how the low horizon of the landscape helps anchor the painting, while the curve of the Madonna's body shelters the two children while creating a very stable triangular shape. How might a writer achieve the stabilizing effect of the horizon line? Could this be done by using descriptions of the character's background or milieu? Michelangelo, late Renaissance classicism. This painting from the early 1500s still works with a strong center. The focal point of this famous painting, the meeting of the fingers, is just off-center. However, the main bulk of the figures is receding toward the periphery, foreshadowing developments of the next 50 years or so. Throughout his career, Michelangelo maintains the ponderous calm we first saw in Giotto's late medieval Madonna. So a question, how could a writer achieve the sedate calm of Michelangelo's paintings? Michelangelo around 1540, The Empty Center. This painting from later in Michelangelo's career shows the transition to what art historians call mannerism. Although Christ the Judge occupies a strong position, the actual center of the painting is empty, and the entire spectacle seems to swirl around that empty center. The swirling structure allows Michelangelo to portray various incidents, such as the rising of the blessed and the torment of the damned, in a huge melange, while maintaining a coherent and readable structure. Netherlands painter Peter Bruegel will adopt this decentered structure around 1560 and build a new vision of narrative painting from it. So let's consider here, how does Michelangelo make use of this vacant center? How does he use that to organize this swirling painting? And what would that mean in terms of a narrative? How does Michelangelo avoid total chaos? Or does he? What lessons has he learned from Botticelli and Leonardo above? How does this chaos relate to the story he's telling? And at last we arrive at Peter Bruegel. Bruegel was born around 1525 or 30 and began his career in the 1550s. He died in apparently 1569, and that gave him a career of not much over 10 years. We're going to watch his development through those years, and we'll begin with a painting that's dated 1558 called Netherlandish Proverbs. It shows his flair here already for capturing village life and lore, or at least a playful and nostalgia-tinged version that would sell to urban patrons. Bruegel uses buildings and a receding vista to organize dozens of anecdotes. While it makes for an exciting picture, the painting could hardly be accused of conveying a coherent narrative. It's closer to an encyclopedia than a novel. Like the high Renaissance painters shown above, this painting has a solid, actually architectural center, a pagoda just like Giotto. But from a narrative and structural viewpoint, the central pagoda has no particular significance. It anchors neither the chaotic scenes nor the meandering narrative elements. Bruegel will soon learn to dispense with such superfluous structures. Wikipedia has a key to about 100 proverbs found in this painting. Some are still current, such as swimming against the tide and beating his head against a brick wall. Others, such as that herring will not fry here, might make a comeback if enough of us agreed to begin using it. Here's a question. What is a fictional equivalent of this painting? What about a musical equivalent? Peter Bruegel, Children's Games. Another painting from around 1558 portraying literally dozens of children's games and possibly painted for the same patron or the same market as the proverbs above. Note the similar use of buildings and the receding vista which Bruegel will always use. He finds it as a way to organize the vignettes so they're not cluttered, but we're still more in the realm of a compendium than a narrative. It seems easier and clearer to read than the proverbs above, and the various figures actually now inhabit the same space instead of simply being jumbled side by side. The center is once again fairly solidly occupied by the jumping and riding characters, but unlike Leonardo or Raphael, the central figures seem to have no special narrative prominence. They just happen to be there. The narrative gains nothing from their position. Question: how might you advise Bruegel to reorganize this painting so it told a story instead of just presenting anecdotes? Peter Bruegel, The Fight Between Carnival and Lent. Probably a slightly later painting, tentatively dated 1559. It's another picture showing numerous vignettes set in a village square. But this time, one of the stories comes to the fore. Down at the bottom, the jousting match of Carnival and Lent, each attended by devotees pushing the combatants toward one another. Probably based on actual incidents, Bruegel now has seen how to make one incident the core of the painting. And this device, using that one incident around which to group many other related narratives, will typify Bruegel's later work. We're moving into the realm of pictorial narrative. Note that, like Michelangelo's Last Judgment portrayed above, the actual center of this painting is virtually empty, a few characters with their backs turned to us. The work is organized around this absent center. A question: the main incident still gets lost in the chaos. What changes might Bruegel make to highlight the jousting battle? What would these changes mean in writing terms? Peter Bruegel, The Fall of the Rebel Angels, from around 1562. Here, Bruegel's working with a strong visual center, unusual for him that it reinforces the center of the story, although Archangel Michael's scrawny arms hardly inspire confidence in the ultimate victory. Bruegel's borrowing many elements here from Hieronymus Bosch, who painted his phantasmagoric altarpieces around 1500. It's possible this work was produced to order for a Bosch living patron. The unusual centrally focused structure is not used to great advantage here. It's quite cluttered and you almost have to search out the figure, and this actually may also have been demanded by the patron. It doesn't seem to suit Bruegel well. Even though the religious-based narrative assures us that the angels will win the final victory, Bruegel delights in depicting a moment when the rebels, along with their magical flying fish, still occupy most of the canvas. So considering this painting, let's think back to Giotto and Botticelli. How might they have reorganized this painting to create more clarity around the central character without losing the detail on the periphery? What might Botticelli have suggested that Bruegel do here? And what about those magical flying fish? What role do those fish play in this painting? If you added something analogous to magical flying fish to your novel, what would it be? Would it be something physical, psychological, metaphysical? Peter Bruegel, The Triumph of Death, also from around 1562. Superficially, this painting resembles children's games above with an unfocused sprawl of vignettes. The difference here is that the separate incidents are subsumed under a sort of metanarrative. Every detail is part of the larger triumph of death, which appears everywhere and nowhere. Notice the bleak structure at the center of the painting, which creates a dark void, that burning castle there, and then on beyond, Bruegel has cleared out the painting, very few figures beyond that, but notice how bleak it remains. So he's found a way to make a landscape, open up his painting a bit here, but maintain the bleak tone. YouTube has some interesting videos and artistic recreations of this painting. Search for Bruegel Death. A question for writers. Think of a novel or a movie perhaps that has this sort of sprawling structure. What holds it together? Do people typically watch or read the entire work? Peter Bruegel, Delegrete or Mad Meg. Another painting from around 1562, and again a melange of bizarre Boschian figures. Delegrete herself strides across the lower part of the painting, as submerged in the melee as Archangel Michael was in the Rebel Angels painting just above. The exact center is again a void, surrounded by the oversized striding figure wearing a boat over their head. From a narrative viewpoint, the center is more a quagmire than a focal point. Bruegel seems torn between the chaos that comes so naturally to him and the desire for a stronger narrative focus. Over the next several years, he would address this problem in dramatically new ways. A question here. Consider Mad Meg's gigantic scale compared to the surrounding figures. What would this mean in terms of a character in a book, assuming they weren't an actual giant? Peter Bruegel, The Census at Bethlehem. We now move into the later phase of Bruegel's career, and most of those last paintings will all be dated around 1565. We're still working with the vacant center and still using the familiar receding vista toward the upper right. Bruegel here makes a major leap, though, toward coherent structure by creating a dark, densely clustered group in the left foreground. The story, still familiar to many today, shows Jesus' parents arriving in the crowded town of Bethlehem. The crowd outside the inn reminds us that Joseph and Mary will find no rooms available, and Jesus will be born in a stable. Perhaps betraying Bruegel's own lack of interest in the actual story, Joseph and Mary are nearly lost in the arriving crowd. That's Mary riding on the donkey just to the right, lower center. As usual, Bruegel seems more interested in the overall winter scene than in the story he's supposedly depicting. It's the overall impression of no room at the inn that he best conveys. Can you think of a book or a movie which treats its main characters in this way? If so, what holds our attention? Peter Bruegel, Peasant Dance, around 1565. This late work features the same elements we saw in the early paintings, a collection of anecdotes set within a village square, but the overall effect is much more unified. We're actually seeing a single slice, a single moment of village life. The center is still virtually empty, occupied by the two kicking legs. The point of view has been brought much lower so the foreground figures are highlighted. The two dancers entering from the right burst into the canvas. The musician and his drunken companion and the two girls dancing in front of them also compete for attention. Further back we see an awkward kiss, and behind that a woman pulling a man into a house. Anecdotes never cease to delight Bruegel. Still, we would never doubt that all these vignettes are part of the same moment. The village dance itself is the main actor in this dramatic work, as the two kicking legs in the center of the painting illustrate. A question. In your writing, or perhaps in your autobiography, what is a key moment around which other anecdotes could be grouped? Peter Bruegel, Wedding Dinner. Again, around 1565, one of Bruegel's most tightly organized works, and one of the few indoor scenes. Note that Bruegel here still employs his familiar diagonally receding sightline. The center is once again pretty much vacant, but unlike Bruegel's earlier works, this painting does not seem to spin around that center. Note how the long, straight lines of the table and the seated guests anchor the work despite the vacant center. Like the peasant dance, a low point of view brings the foreground figures to prominence. Although each of the characters in the background is virtually telling their own story, they don't compete as much for attention, and they don't distract from the overall impression of warm-hearted abundance. A question. What structural and/or narrative functions do the wine jars and the pie-eating boy in the lower left serve? How would you include a detail like this in your own writing so that it served both a narrative and a structural function? Peter Bruegel, Autumn Harvest. Again, around 1565, one of a series of paintings showing village life during the seasons. The anecdotes have been reduced to a minimum here, although Bruegel still can't resist a few comic touches, such as the sprawled, snoring figure in front of the tree. The center is again vacant, but note how the tree, just slightly off-center, and also seen in the nearly contemporary winter scene below, provides a structural anchor for the entire panorama. The tree also serves as a narrative anchor, providing a special place where the workers can gather for lunch. To grasp how important the tree is, see the next picture, a nearly identical painting by Bruegel's son that omits this one key element. A question. How does Bruegel achieve the elegiac calm of this painting? What are some methods he uses here? What effect does the sprawled sleeper have on the overall tone? How would you achieve this tone in narrative writing? Peter Bruegel the Younger, Autumn Harvest. We'll detour for a moment to 1624, when Peter Bruegel's son, Peter the Younger, copied various figures from the autumn harvest, but he loses the grandeur of the vista and he loses the overall focus. Look how much is lost by that tree. It's been replaced by a sheaf of hay. It just doesn't do the same job. Without the tree as anchor, the painting falls into a collection of separate figures, which is just what Peter Bruegel the Elder had learned to avoid around 1565. So let's consider this in narrative terms. How might we use descriptions and milieu to create a sense of the tree that anchors the first painting and not the sheaf of hay that gets lost in the second? What would this mean in narrative terms? Peter Bruegel the Elder, winter scene, again about 1565. We'll conclude with Bruegel at his most eloquent, conveying a story of a Northern European winter without highlighting any one aspect of the painting. He uses his familiar vacant center and receding vista to organize a picture of a snowbound village at one moment. Unlike his earliest paintings, the games and the proverbs, we see a moment here of village life, and yet it's once again, nothing is highlighted. Everything's on an equal footing. Except maybe that tree. Here's our tree from a couple of pictures above. Notice how the tree helps anchor and stabilize the broad panorama, and at the same time, it echoes the bleak, wintry tone of the whole scene. Let's take a look, too, at those two birds right at lower center. What are they doing? What do they add to this picture here? They're as prominent as anything in this picture. What are they adding? Can you think of a book or a movie that has a similarly diffuse focus? What holds it together? What unifies this painting? What is the role of those birds? Why are they there? What do they add? What might this mean in narrative terms? And that concludes our brief survey of narrative structures in Peter Bruegel's art. A big thanks to Mr. Bruegel for allowing us to reproduce his art and for cooperating in the production of this show. You can find more magical writing tools, a free downloadable booklet, and listings of our upcoming classes at directaction.org/magicalwriter, or just Google Magical Writer. On behalf of Peter Bruegel and myself, Luke Hauser, ciao for now.